Well, thank you all for coming here. I'll get started now. I know there's a chance that we might have a few more people coming in, but this is a really great group we have today. So I won't hesitate any further. I think that all of you know me, but in case anybody I have not met is here. My name is Salel, and I'm the curator of Japanese art here. Mostly I work with the Japanese print collection, and as you have probably noticed, I have taken over the museum in the past few months. And once Mary Cassatt was gone, which even that I was partially involved with, and now it's almost impossible to get through the museum without coming across works of Japanese art. This is one component of that series of exhibitions, and I will talk a little bit about not only this show, but the way this relates to all of the other ones. I wanted to say that this show, Enduring Impressions, is a collaboration between the Honolulu Museum of Art and the Portland Japanese Garden. After the show closes here in about a month, we will pack up these artworks and ship them to Portland. And the show there will open in March of 2026, and it will continue until June. So if any of you have a second home in the Pacific Northwest, and I have met a surprising number of folks who do, please feel free to visit the Portland version of this show. They're going to expand it a little bit with the works of Aya Morton, a Portland-based artist and illustrator. And they have quite large galleries there, even bigger than this gallery here. So they will be able to talk about the artworks in a much more elaborate way. There's a question about what it is this show represents. And it's mostly what I want to talk to you about is that, is this Japanese art that we're looking at? Well, kind of, not, but not exactly. Let me explain. You have a photo of a temple. Could I borrow that? Sure. Thank you. Does anybody recognize this Buddhist temple? It's a Buddhist temple.
Don't we have some replica one in Honolulu?
Similar. That's a Shinto shrine that over near Kaneohe. This is a Buddhist temple that's located in Nara City, Japan. And when people visit, a lot of people who are interested in Chinese Buddhist architecture go and visit this temple. Now that might sound kind of strange. Why would somebody who's interested in Chinese architecture go to Japan? Well, the reason is because this temple, Morinoue Temple, which was built in the year 607, was made at a time when Buddhism was being imported from China into Japan. And this was one of those temples that was actually made in a Chinese architectural style. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the historical developments of China during the 20th century. Well, unfortunately, due to like the Cultural Revolution, a lot of the Buddhist temples and the Buddhist architecture in China no longer survives. And so in order to learn about this cultural tradition from China, one actually goes not to China, but to Nara City, Japan. And why am I talking about that? Well, it's sort of an analogy to the situation of Japanese woodblock printmaking. The history of Japanese woodblock printmaking spans 400 years. The story begins around 1620 in the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. And the story continues until today. But the center of that story is no longer Tokyo. I would argue that the story now continues outside of Japan, in the same way that Chinese Buddhist architecture is now preserved outside of China. That 400-year-long history of Japanese printmaking begins with a kind of classical period that lasts about 250 years, roughly matching up with the Edo period, during which Japan was under a policy of isolationism. The Japanese government had closed off its ports to international trade and didn't allow other cultural influences, particularly Christianity, to enter into the country. And during that 250 years, the style of woodblock printmaking that was produced, we refer to as ukiyo-e. And an example of that style, if I may, thank you, is the work of Katsushika Hokusai. This is, don't worry, it's just a reproduction print. I'm not damaging some precious print in our collection. But this is a reproduction of a print from Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji. You mostly see a scene of daily life in the foreground, but off in the background you see Mount Fuji. So what is characteristic about ukiyo-e? In particular, the way that it was made. It was a very collaborative effort. There was the person who we refer to as the artist. More accurately, we would call him the designer. In this case, Hokusai. And he drew the initial sketch. Once he was finished, he passed his sketch on to a group of carvers who would take the print and use it to carve a group of wood blocks. Basically, one block for every color in the final design. There's probably a surprising number of colors in this print, probably about 15 to 20 different colors. And so there were probably about 15 to 20 different blocks that these carvers made. After they were finished, they passed their blocks on to a group of professional printers who would ink up those blocks and take a piece of paper and one by one press them on these wood blocks in order to make this final print. And and in addition to all of these carvers and printers and the designer, you also had a publisher who financed this entire operation and made sure the entire thing went well. Sort of similar to a modern day movie producer. An extremely time-intensive and laborious way of producing prints, but as you can see, extremely beautiful results. Some of you may be familiar with the other show on printmaking that we're doing upstairs, the show called Lyrically Rebellious, The Prince of Onshi Koshiro. I believe we have a catalog here. Thank you. And this represents the second stage of woodblock printmaking, the modern stage. At least it's one movement during the modern period, which is basically from about 1880 until 1980. And the two movements in this modern period of printmaking were the creative print movement, represented by the work of Onshi Koshiro. If you haven't, please take a look at the exhibition upstairs. And the Shinhanga movement, or the New Prince movement, which is a subject that my colleagues and I will do an exhibition on in 2 years in celebration of the museum's centennial. So please look forward to that. Let me tell you a little bit more, though, about the creative print movement. The reason why it is distinct from ukiyo-e prints, traditional Japanese prints, is because in a sort of modern spirit, the artists decided to emulate European printmakers, and instead of relying upon a large group of artisans like professional woodblock carvers and professional printers, these modern artists like Onshi Koshiro, each of those artists decided to manage all aspects of the printmaking process. So when you look at a print by Onshi Koshiro, he did everything in the process. All of the carving, all the printing, of course the initial sketch, and you get a strong feeling of the artist's emotions for that reason. It isn't diluted by the contributions of many assistants. It's all the work of one artist. Does that make sense? Okay. And that, in a nutshell, is the way in which Japanese printmaking modernized during the 20th century. It's kind of similar to the kind of modern art that was produced in other parts of the world. For example, in the United States here, abstract expressionism was a quintessential example of American modern art. And let us imagine the drip paintings of Jackson Pollock. Of course, like the work of Onshi Koshiro, that work was produced by a single person. And when we look at Pollock's paintings, we get a very strong feeling of how the artist was feeling at the time he was producing his artwork. You can say that there was a great deal of randomness to his artwork, but to the extent that he was able to control the dripping and whatnot, we get a strong sense of how the artist was feeling and something about his soul. Well, when I mention the word soul, it sounds kind of like I'm talking about spirituality or religion, doesn't it? In fact, there is a certain amount of faith that we invest in modern art when we talk about it, just like spirituality or religion. And there's a certain belief that this modern art is actually communicating to us something about the artist's personality. And what is interesting is that after a certain amount of time, that faith in modern art eventually gave way to cynicism. And I said that the second stage of Japanese printmaking, the modern stage, ended around the 1980s. And it was very similar to American modern art. Around the 1980s, for some reason, maybe I think it's rather complicated with economic and social and technological factors. But for some reason, around the 1980s, you see people developing a very cynical attitude towards art. And they lost the belief that the artist was truly communicating through this artwork. And also, there seemed to be a sort of cultural identity crisis that happened, in which people wondered if, for example, abstract expressionism truly expressed something that was quintessentially American. And in the same way, the artists who were involved with the creative prints movement in Japan, which had been quite successful for several decades, reached a point where they wondered if there was really something that was quintessentially Japanese about the work that they were doing. And eventually, around the 1980s, both the creative prints movement and the Shinhanga movement lost popularity. And we entered into the third stage, which it's such a terrible name, and I have no idea why it became popular, but the term postmodern is the way people talk about this third stage. just try to put aside the ridiculous contradictions that the term postmodern brings up in our minds if we invest any logical thought into it. But basically, in this third stage, we see people who have lost faith in the cultural identity of their home nation, but they're still interested in art. They're still curious about art on a more international level. And you start to see people becoming very curious about the art traditions of other cultures and maybe adopting those traditions for themselves. So one example is I know of this Caucasian fellow who grew up in San Diego, California, and around the 1990s decided to devote his life to the study of Japanese art history. Absolutely crazy, but case in point. But here's maybe a more relevant example. The publisher Cathan Brown. Has anybody heard of her before?
Mm-hmm.
Crown Point Press, right?
San Francisco.
Exactly. In San Francisco, California, there's this very prestigious publishing house called Crown Point Press. And in 1982, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of her studio, the owner, Cathan Brown, decided to start an interesting project that reflects this new consciousness. Up until then, she had been working with American artists like, for example, the portrait artist Chuck Close, and had been making prints with him at her studio in San Francisco. But around 1982, Cathan Brown decided to start this project where she would invite artists such as Chuck Close to join her on a trip to Kyoto. And there in Kyoto, she and Chuck would work with a traditional woodblock printer and a traditional woodblock carver and make some artwork that was wonderfully multicultural. Of course, the imagery was designed by Chuck Close himself, but the technique and to some extent the appearance of the work was strongly connected to traditional Japanese woodblock printmaking. Well, Cathan continued this project for about 7 years. And although she eventually decided to stop it, in 1997, you can see that the effects that her project had. The Japanese government opened a department called the Center for the Science of Human Endeavor.
Whoa!
It's about as meaningful of a title as the term postmodernism, right? But this mysteriously titled department had a very interesting purpose. Their job was to organize artist in residency programs in different parts of Japan where they could invite foreign artists, that is, artists who were not from Japan, to come visit and to spend a couple of weeks intensively studying how to make traditional Japanese woodblock prints. they made a few interesting changes in their program. They decided, for example, that they would use water-based inks, and they advertised these materials as environmentally friendly and non-toxic. So very much in line with a 21st century interest in the environment and health. But otherwise, they were, as faithfully as possible, trying to promote these traditions of Japanese woodblock printmaking, ukiyo-e. And this department, the Center for the Study of Human Endeavors, continued for several years and blossomed. Eventually, around the year 2011, in fact, there was a sudden, this project entered a new chapter and started to gain great momentum because two things happened. One is that these organizers finally came up with a residency program that functioned very efficiently and became very popular. They called that program MILAB, the Mokuhanga Innovation Laboratory. Mokuhanga is the Japanese term for woodblock printmaking, like the works you see around us here. And in that same year, 2011, these organizers founded an association, which was simply called the International Mokuhanga Association. This group met once every 3 years. The first year they met in Kyoto. 3 years later, their second meeting was in Tokyo. But because so many of the participants in this movement, which, like in the residency programs, were artists from all around the world, including a great number of Americans, the organizers wondered, why are we limiting ourselves to Japan? So in the third meeting, which occurred in 2017, they held a meeting here in Honolulu at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and further activities at the Donkey Mill Art Center in Halualoa on the Big Island. So this is a good opportunity for me to introduce the artists in this show, because they are all more or less from this organization. Let me begin with April Vollmer. April, some of you might have met April. She came to visit us here at Homa a few weeks ago. She grew up in New York City, and if you ask her about New York-based modern art like abstract expressionism, she will talk your ear off. But she is thoroughly invested in mokuhanga printmaking nowadays, and has been doing it for, I think, about 30 years. She focuses a great deal on images of birds, as you can see in these works here. I have a few others in the cases, the wall case and the freestanding case. But she's fascinated by the idea of ornithomancy, the divination of the flight patterns of birds. In other words, if you look at a flock of birds and the way in which their patterns morph as they move through the sky, that those shapes can essentially tell your fortune. And she began working on this series of imagery around the time that her parents passed away and when she was going through some existential turning points in her life. So if you're wondering how she became interested in such mystical ideas, that's partly why. In addition to making prints, April is an author. Thank you so much, perfect timing. And she has written something that is sort of like the Bible of the International Creative Prints movement. The book is called Japanese Woodblock Print Workshop. If any of you are curious, we do I think, have a few more copies on sale in the bookshop, and they're signed by April. But she has become sort of like the literary spokesperson for this movement. Quite an amazing person in many regards. Another member of this exhibition, and another founding member of the International Mokuhanga Association, is Yoonmi now. Yoonmi has an equally prestigious background. She's a professor of printmaking at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. And I was mentioning to you about how this association has meetings every 3 years. Yoonmi will be hosting the 2027 meeting of the association in Lawrence. And so there's maybe a little bit of question about how many people will fly from all over the world to the bustling metropolis of Lawrence. I think that we were a little bit lucky being here in Honolulu. A lot of people wanted to come to Hawaii. But anyways, Yoonmi will be hosting the 2027 meeting. And regarding her artwork, Yoonmi was born and raised in South Korea before moving to the United States. And while a lot of the American-based artists like April were inspired by the works of Hokusai and other traditional ukiyo-e works, Yoonmi was actually more interested in the woodblock prints that were produced centuries ago in Korea and China. And when growing up, she was looking at those woodblock printed books. And these prints that she displays here reflect the sensibility of those precedents to some extent. The flower that she uses in each of her prints here, and like April, she has one in the wall case and one in this freestanding case. The flower is a white chrysanthemum. And it's a symbol of mortality in South Korea. Sort of like a symbol of vanitas. And here she's kind of making a visual pun. She's placing this flower like a ikebana arrangement, not in a beautiful vase, but in a paper container for instant ramen, or mac and cheese, or some other like microwave food. And she's making some sort of subtle commentaries on contemporary culture, contemporary culture in America, Japan, and South Korea. The way in which we use these products and immediately dispose of them, the kind of waste that these products reflect, and the way that sense of waste is connected to the idea of mortality. More generally, like many of the other artists here, she's making subtle comments on the state of our environment and the fragility of the environment. Let me move on to Mr. Takenaka Kenji, whose work is over in the corner here. Takenaka Sensei was born and raised in Kyoto, and he is the 5th generation heir of a printmaking studio called Takezasado. His background is quite different from other members of the show here. But I wanted to include him here, not only because he is genuinely an important person in this mokuhanga history. He actually gave a printmaking demonstration at the first International Mokuhanga Association meeting in Kyoto back in 2011, and actually taught certain printmaking techniques to April and Yoonmi and several other members at that time. But I wanted to show with his inclusion that this mokuhanga movement is not simply a bunch of foreigners. There are Japanese members of this movement. It's a little bit tricky talking about Takenaka Sensei, however, because he was born into a printmaking, he was destined to be a printmaker from the time he was born. And he politely distances himself from the other printmakers in this movement for that reason. In other words, he has a little bit of an ego. But for a very good reason. For example, what is he doing here with these 5 artworks? He is showing 5 traditional flowers of the seasons, bellflower, sakura, cherry blossoms, etc. But sort of to show off his printmaking capabilities, he has produced each of these flowers in a different style of printmaking. For example, the first print here, the morning glories, he produced this in the style of traditional ukiyo-e prints. The ink is very thin, and so it is absorbed into the paper. And you can see that he has created a line around each of the shapes in his design here. By contrast, this image of cherry blossoms he produced in the technique of kyohanga. That is the Kyoto style of printmaking, in which it's kind of similar to modern Japanese painting. He uses a lot of ground clamshell powder, gofun, and the ink for that reason is much thicker. And if you get up close, it's kind of hard to see because he's using very subtle shades of pink against a white background. But if you get up close, you'll see that it feels very thick, like a Nihonga painting. He starts off by covering the entire paper with a layer of white ink, and on top of that he does the petals in a very light pink, a deeper pink for the center of the flowers. So that's showing you the kyohanga technique. And then in these other images, he's talking about, for example, the style of woodblock printmaking that was popular around the time that the international mokuhanga movement began in the 1990s. And in this one, sort of a 21st century contemporary style of woodblock printmaking. So he's very prolific in his styles. Another artist in the show here is Hiroki Morinoue. Hiroki and his wife Setsuko, who produced the three-dimensional works in the freestanding case and the wall case, they are located on the Big Island, and I mentioned a little while ago, they run an art center, Donkey Mill Art Center. They are Japanese American. Setsuko, I believe, was born and raised in Japan. And Hiroki, I believe his grandfather immigrated from Japan. So he's third generation Japanese American. Hiroki is probably the most political artist in this exhibition. And for the past decade or so, he has been working on a series of woodblock prints that he refers to as the 100 Views of Water. They are rather abstract, with some symbolic imagery in them. Like, for example, in this one you see the reflection of Mount Fuji in this rippling water here. And other pieces you'll see maybe a leaf or some fish. The subjects that he discusses in his prints are usually something about the environment's fragility. For example, in his artist statement here, he talks about his concerns about not only environmental disasters like oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the prints here is entitled Gulf of Mexico. But also the way in which global warming is becoming more and more of a crisis. For example, Hurricane Katrina and the disasters in New Orleans. Hiroki's very serious work is offset by that of his wife Setsuko. And let's see, how can I best do this? I'm going to crash right through you all and walk over to this wall face here. We have 3 works by Setsuko. Her work, like her personality, by the way, if you have a chance to visit the Morinoue on the Big Island, I highly suggest it. They're not only brilliant art teachers, but they're just wonderful human beings in general. Setsuko's sort of light-hearted personality is conveyed through these vessels. And you may ask, why are we showing these works of pottery in a show about woodblock printmaking? Well, after she fires these ceramic vessels, Setsuko makes woodblock prints and then collages each of the ceramic works with those prints. So the coloration on them, she hasn't painted them or anything like that. They're actually works of paper that she has covered the ceramic pieces with. She, in this series, is talking about the Japanese concept of Shochikubai, the 3 friends of winter: pine, bamboo, and plum. And so she has basically 2 sets of pieces, and one of them is a reference to pine, sho. Another is a reference to bamboo, chiku, and another is a reference to plum, bai. Why we call these different plants the 3 friends of winter? They are the most enduring plants. And for example, a plum tree is the first tree to blossom in the new year. Even if it's snowing, sometimes you will see a plum tree blossoming amidst that cold. A bamboo, of course, it grows at an extremely fast rate and doesn't die off during the cold weather. And a pine is equally evergreen. So it is a very positive sort of symbol of endurance amidst hardship. A classic symbol in Japanese art and literature. And it's really interesting to see Setsuko using that traditional symbolism in her artwork. The last artist in the show is Miho, who is Hiroki's and Setsuko's daughter. Miho is actually a trained ballet dancer. She is sort of a Renaissance artist. Years ago, she formally trained in ballet, and after graduating from a dance school, moved to New York and worked in a ballet troupe for about 10 years. Eventually, she decided to retire and move back to Hawaii. She's now living with her parents and decided to follow in their footsteps and began to pursue graphic art. The approach she takes to woodblock printmaking is as fascinating as her variety of talents. The prints that she makes here, these 3 works, are an example of reductive printmaking. So although I told you earlier on about how in traditional ukiyo-e you have 1 block for each color in the design, here Miho is using a single block. She'll carve a little bit, print the lightest color, and then take the same block and continue carving into it. Print the next darkest color, continue carving into the block over and over again. If you look at her final design, I can see about 20 or so different colors in here. Extremely meticulous, extremely labor intensive. And as you can imagine, very popular. So these are the 6 artists who are representing the international Mokohanga movement. Let me wrap up here by talking about what this all means about the direction that woodblock printmaking from Japan is going. I talked about these 3 different stages of cultural development: traditional, modern, and postmodern. And I think that it's quite fitting that this show is traveling to the Portland Japanese Garden after it finishes here, because I think that our museum and an institution like Portland Japanese Garden are some of the places where traditional Japanese culture will continue to thrive. Even though we have entered a time when people are not holding on to their own culture's traditions as tightly as they used to, in art museums or cultural centers throughout the world, you do see people who are intrigued by these traditions and are doing the best they can to further them. And just in the past few years, the way that I have seen the Portland Japanese Garden blossom as an institution, pardon the pun, I think that it's very encouraging. I think that even if for the time being people within Japan are not holding on tightly to old traditions, I think that people in other parts of the world, including us, will help to keep those traditions alive. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all so much for supporting this show and for keeping this artwork and these traditions alive and well. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Did you want to show that?
Oh, there was another book that I skipped over, wasn't there? Oh, no problem. Thank you so much. I did forget to mention that in addition to being an amazing, let me go back over here. In addition to being an amazing printmaker, Takenaka sensei has published this rather impressive book that's bilingual and that talks about the printmaking process from not only a traditional ukiyo-e point of view, but also he talks about the modernization of printmaking, including references to the creative print movement and the Shinhanga movement. And like April's book, we have signed copies of Takenaka Sensei's book available in the bookshop. Sorry for the shameless commercial endorsement there, but it was just such a thrill to have these artists come all the way from New York or Kyoto to visit the show here and to share with us their ideas and the fruits of their labor. I do hope that we have a chance to work with these artists again, and I'm so grateful to them for teaching me the way in which our collection of Japanese prints here extends to the present and into the future.